Hi there, so today we are going to be going over the use of structure in the play Macbeth by William Shakespeare. So I'm going to start off by giving a brief definition of the meaning of structure in an English literature context. So structure is essentially the shape of the text. It's the form that the piece takes, if you will. And that can be in the form of the structure of the plot, so the events that happen, the way in which they are laid out. And it can also mean the language itself, so perhaps the composition and formation of sentences or rhythms that are created by the words that the author chooses. And rhythm, for example, is something that William Shakespeare played around with in a lot of his pieces. But today specifically, we'll be talking about the use of structure in the plot of Macbeth. So, the structure of Macbeth is chronological, and this means that the events are revealed to the audience or reader in the order in which they happened. So they follow in the right order on the timeline, if you were to write it all out, for example. And the events are organized into 5 separate acts. And it should be noted that this actually would have probably happened after William Shakespeare's death. He might not have written it this way, but rather after his death, when his work was edited and brought together, that would probably be when the events were organized into 5 separate acts, with sort of breaks in between them. And these acts obviously contain individual scenes within them. So, the concept of a 5-act structure, which is the structure that Macbeth takes, was developed by a German author called Gustav Freytag, and he suggested that there were 5 different stages within a tragic dramatic structure. So he broke it down into 5 different segments, giving each segment a different name and detailing the events that would happen within the segment. So today we are going to go through the names of these segments and what they consisted of, and then we are going to put them in the context of Macbeth and talk about the specifics within Macbeth, and where that fits into the structure. So first we have the exposition. This is the first segment, and it introduces the characters, the settings, and the events and key ideas. So this is when we begin to gather a sense of who the important people are in this story. We get an idea of the setting of the play, where it's taking place, the time it's taking place at, and we'll also begin to get our first hints of the key themes that are going to occur. So, after that, we move on to the rising action, and this is a series of related events occur leading up to the key moment within the plot. So this is when the action begins to ramp up, more things begin to happen, everything begins to gain pace a little bit, if you will. Next, we move on to the climax. Now, people often give different definitions to the climax of a piece. A lot of people like to state that it is the kind of point of highest intensity within a play, which is definitely true. However, specifically in a tragic context, so when we're talking about a tragic dramatic structure, and if Macbeth is a tragedy, the climax would actually instead represent the turning point of the play. And up to this point, things have gone well for our main character, in this case Macbeth. And it is at this point that things begin to go downhill for him and or her, depending on the play. And the tragedy really begins to unfold. Things start to go wrong from this point onwards, basically. After that, we have the falling action. The falling action is the main conflict between the protagonist and the antagonist is established. So in this case, Macbeth, the central character, and his kind of opposition, Macduff, their conflict is really developed and builds up, if you will. And that eventually leads to the catastrophe. Now, the protagonist is then defeated by the antagonist and the events return to a state of normality. That is what the catastrophe means. So, I have developed a little diagram here at the bottom, which you should be able to see. And this should represent give a visual aid of the structure and each segment and where it falls in. And we're going to talk about the specifics of Macbeth and how they fit into this structure. So Act 1, the exposition. Main characters are introduced, we meet Macbeth, we meet Lady Macbeth, etc. The witches begin to make their predictions, so they start to give their omens, and the thoughts of murder start to form. So this is where we begin to set the scene. This is where we begin to get a sense and understanding of the characters in the story, as I mentioned earlier. Then we head up to the rising action. Now these arrows should essentially represent how well things are going for the protagonist, so in this case Macbeth, and they also represent a sense of normality. So at the exposition, things are continuing on as normal. Nothing has changed yet. And it's at the rising action where things begin to take a change and we begin to move away from normality. And the rising action is essentially when Macbeth keeps changing his mind. This is in Act 2. And Lady Macbeth starts to take control and she begins to manipulate, and King Duncan's murder occurs. And this is a very key moment in the production, obviously. So the rising action leads all the way up to the climax. Now the climax is Act 3 in Macbeth, and this is where Macbeth becomes king. Banquo is murdered, Fleance escapes, and Macduff joins Malcolm in England. So these events, this is where things begin to go wrong for our protagonist. This is where things begin to go downhill. And then we head down with the falling action. Now, I think it would be a mistake to see these arrows as representing a sort of level of intensity, because the falling action and the catastrophe are arguably the most intense moments of the production, but they still represent us moving towards normality. So even though the intensity is rising, we are still moving back towards normality because the storyline is continuing and things have taken that turning point. That can be a little bit confusing. It's not very intuitive, but hopefully that does make sense. So we're heading down to the falling action. This is Act 4. Macbeth returns to the witches. Macduff's family is slaughtered. Malcolm and Macduff plan their invasion. So this is where the conflict between Macduff and Macbeth is really heating up, and we're heading towards the catastrophe. And even though, as I just said, the catastrophe is probably the most intense moment of the play, it is the moment that brings us back to normality, which is what our arrow here represents. So we end with the catastrophe. This is Act 5. The invasion is carried out and Malcolm becomes king. The witches' predictions come true in unexpected ways, and both Macbeth and Lady Macbeth die. So this is the culmination of the play. This is the big finale, if you will. But as I just said, it is also the point in which things move back to a state of normality, where things fall back into their rightful place. So that is a brief overview of the use of structure in Macbeth, specifically the tragic dramatic structure. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.